Hello, Chicago. It is my great pleasure to introduce my friend Arundhati Roy. About 20 years ago, The God of Small Things came out and won the Booker Award. And so now we could say it was 20 years ago today, Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play, and she has now come back with a new book, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. Her fiction is prophetic, visionary, dangerous, insurrectionary, haunting, and beautiful. Her political writing is prophetic, visionary, dangerous, beautiful, haunting, ecstatic, fierce. And she occupies a space in the world that I don't think too many people do. Maybe Noam Chomsky is sort of an intellectual rock star, but as an artist, world intellectual, visionary thinker, it's a short list. And if you haven't read Walking with the Comrades, Listening to Grasshoppers, The End of Imagination, Field Notes on Democracy, The Doctor and the Saint, Capitalism, A Ghost Story, amongst others, you got lucky because you're in for a treat. Give a rocking Chicago welcome to the one and only, the great Arundhati Roy and Jennifer Day of the Chicago Tribune.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here today. I'm going to just start with a very short reading from the Ministry of Utmost Happiness. It's a little difficult to pick out passages to read from this book because everything's so interconnected, but I'm sure the connections will come out in the conversation. The chapter I'm going to read from is called The Tenant. And it's, just to give you a little context, it's about a woman called Tilotama who has just picked up a little baby that appeared on the pavement in the streets of New Delhi and made off with her before the police could come and take the baby and put it in a state orphanage. So the chapter starts with a quote from Jean Genet, which goes, "Then, as she had already died 4 or 5 times, the apartment had remained available for a drama more serious than her own death. The spotted owlet on the streetlight ducked and bobbed with the delicacy and immaculate manners of a Japanese businessman. He had an unobstructed view through the window of the small bare room and the odd bare woman on the bed. She had an unobstructed view of him too. Some nights she bobbed back and said moshi moshi, which was all the Japanese she knew. Even indoors, the walls radiated a bullying, unyielding heat. The slow ceiling fan stirred the scorched air, layering it with fine, cindery dust. The room showed signs of celebration. The balloons tied to the window grill bumped into each other desultorily, softened and shriveled by the heat. In the center, on a low painted stool, was a cake with bright strawberry icing and sugar flowers, a candle with a charred wick, a matchbox, and a few used matchsticks. On the cake it said, "Happy birthday, Miss Jibin." The cake had been cut, a small piece eaten. The icing had melted and dribbled onto the silver foil-colored cardboard cake base. Ants were making off with crumbs larger than themselves. Black ants, pink crumbs. The baby, whose birthday and baptism ceremonies had been simultaneously celebrated and successfully concluded, was fast asleep. Her kidnapper, who went by the name of S. Tilotama, was awake and concentrating. She could hear her hair growing. It sounded like something crumbling, a burnt thing crumbling. coal, toast, moths crisped on a light bulb. She remembered reading somewhere that even after people died, their hair and nails kept growing, like starlight traveling through the universe long after the stars themselves had died, like cities, fizzy, effervescent, simulating the illusion of life, while the planet they had plundered died around them. She thought of the city at night, of cities at night, discarded constellations of old stars fallen from the sky, rearranged on earth in patterns and pathways and towers, invaded by weevils that have learned to walk upright. A weevil philosopher with a grave manner and a sharp mustache was teaching a class, reading aloud from a book. Admiring young weevils strained to catch each word that spilled from his wise weevil lips. Nietzsche believed that if pity were to become the core of ethics, misery would become contagious and happiness an object of suspicion. The youngsters scratched away on their little notepads. Schopenhauer, on the other hand, believed that pity is and ought to be the supreme weevil virtue. But long before them, Socrates asked the key question, why should we be moral? He had lost a leg in Weevil World War IV, this professor, and carried a cane. His remaining 5 legs were in excellent condition. Airbrush graffiti sprayed on the back wall of his classroom said, "Evil weevils always make the cut." Other creatures crowded into the already crowded classroom. An alligator with a human skin purse, a grasshopper with good intentions, a fish on a fast, a fox with a flag, a maggot with a manifesto, a neocon newt, an icon iguana, a communist cow, an owl with an alternative, a lizard on TV. Hello and welcome, you're watching Lizard News at 9. There's been a blizzard on Lizard Island. The baby was the beginning of something. This much the kidnapper knew. Her bones had whispered this to her that night. The said night, the concerned night, the aforementioned night, the night hereinafter referred to as the night, when she made her move on the pavement. And her bones were nothing if not reliable informants. The baby was Miss Jibin returned. Returned, that is, not to her. Miss Jibin the first was never hers, but to the world. Miss Jibin the second, when she was grown to be a lady, would settle accounts and square the books. Miss Jibin would turn the tide. There was hope yet for the evil weevil world. Naga asked Tilo for one good reason why she was leaving him. Did he not love her? Had he not been caring, considerate, generous, understanding? Why now, after all these years? He said 14 years was enough time for anyone to get over anything, provided they wanted to get over it. People had been through much worse. Oh, that, she said. I got over all that long ago. I'm happy and well adjusted now, like the people of Kashmir. I've learned to love my country. I may even vote in the next election. He let that pass. He said she should think about seeing a psychiatrist. Thinking made her throat ache. That was a good reason not to think about seeing a psychiatrist. Naga had started wearing tweed coats and smoking cigars like his father did, and talking to servants in the imperious way that his mother did. Termites on toast, khadi loincloths, and the rolling stones were a forgotten, fevered dream from a past life. Naga's mother, who lived alone on the ground floor of the big house, his father, Ambassador Shiva Shankar Hariharan, had died, advised him to let Tilo go. She won't be able to manage on her own. She'll beg you to take her back. But Naga knew otherwise. Tilo would manage, and even if she didn't, there would be no begging. He sensed she was drifting on a tide that neither he nor she could do much about. He couldn't tell whether her restlessness, her compulsive and increasingly unsafe wandering through the city, marked the onset of an unsoundness of mind or an acute, perilous kind of sanity? Or were they both the same thing? The only thing he could attribute her newfound restiveness to was her mother's bizarre passing, which he thought odd given that it was a relationship that had barely existed. True, Thilo had been at her bedside during the last 2 weeks in hospital, but other than that, she had seen her mother only a few times in the past several years. Naga was right in one sense, but wrong in another. Her mother's death had released Thilo from an internment that nobody, including she herself, had been aware of, because it had passed itself off as something quite the opposite, a peculiar insular independence. For all of her adult life, Thilo had defined and shaped herself by marking off and maintaining a distance between herself and her mother. When that was no longer necessary, something frozen began to thaw, and something unfamiliar began to take its place. Naga's pursuit of Thilo had not turned out as planned. She was meant to be just another easy conquest, yet another woman who succumbed to his irreverent brilliance and edgy charm and had her heart broken. But Thilo had crept up on him and become some kind of compulsion, an addiction almost. Addiction has its own mnemonics: skin, smell, the length of the loved one's fingers. In Thilo's case, it was the slant of her eyes, the shape of her mouth, the almost invisible scar that slightly altered the symmetry of her lips and made her look defiant even when she did not mean to. The way her nostrils flared, announcing her displeasure even before her eyes did. The way she held her shoulders, the way she sat on the pot, stark naked, and smoked cigarettes. So many years of marriage, the fact that she was not young anymore and did nothing to pretend otherwise didn't change the way he felt. Because it had to do with more than all that. It was the haughtiness, despite the question mark over her stock, as his mother had not hesitated to put it. It had to do with the way she lived in the country of her own skin, a country that issued no visas and seemed to have no consulates. True, it had never been a particularly friendly country, even at the best of times, but its borders were sealed and the regime of more or less complete isolationism began only after the train wreck at the Shiraz cinema. Naga married Thilo because he was never really able to reach her, and because he couldn't reach her, he couldn't let her go. Of course, that raises another question. Why did Thilo marry Naga? A generous person would say it was because she needed shelter. A less generous view would be that it was because she needed cover. Although his was only a small part in the story, in Naga's mind, before and after Shiraz sometimes took on the overtones of BC and AD. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the reading and for being here with us tonight.
It's my pleasure.
We're thrilled to have you. So let's start with the fact that this book is your first novel in 20 years. So you've been writing quite a bit of nonfiction in the meantime, but why did you decide to return to fiction now?
The decision wasn't mine. Fiction returned to me. You know, I've never been the kind of person who felt that it, you know, because I had written a book, it was my duty to write another book at a given interval of time, or many other books, you know. And for me, fiction is something far too profound and far too beautiful to turn into a career, you know. And so all I did was wait. And then the characters in this book came knocking at the door, and they dropped in and they visited, and then they stayed longer, and then they just wouldn't move out. So I was just there with the gang, you know, of people who people this book. And truly, they were not going to let me go until I finished it. But I was never under any pressure, you know. I never felt under any pressure to write something just because I had written something earlier.
Did you feel any pressure given the amazing success that your debut novel had received in The God of Small Things?
You know, to be honest, no. Because it's too internal a process. You know, the conversations are too private between me and the characters for pressure out from the outside to count as anything, you know? And to me, the idea of living up to people's expectations is not a very nice one, you know, because most of the time in my life I'm like confounding people's expectations. And especially the last 20 years, you know, I mean, certainly it hasn't been a life where every time I wrote something, people stood up and applauded. Quite the opposite, you know. So it was like, to me, perhaps a small story would explain this attitude. When I was very small, living in a village in Kerala, my uncle, who's Chaco in The God of Small Things, who's a Rhodes Scholar who gave up his academic life to become a failed pickle maker in a small village in Kerala, where he spent most of his time organizing a labor union against himself. I think I might have been 5 years old or something, and you know, everyone was giving me advice about work hard, come first, run faster, jump higher, whatever. And he showed me some kind of a cheap bauble, and he said, "You want this?" And of course, my greedy heart coveted it, and I said, "Yes." He said, "I'll give it to you if you fail." And it really made me stop in my tracks. I still remember, as a very young person, and think about the idea of failure, which which goes hand in hand with the idea of risk and the idea of some kind of obstinacy. You know, that so to me, there was nothing in writing. I'd written The God of Small Things the way I wanted to write it. But I didn't want to write the son of the God of Small Things and the God of Small Things too, you know. So I wanted to roll the dice and try to explore fiction in another way.
So you said the characters sort of came to live with you. These characters all sort of live in between worlds. There are references to people falling between cracks in the world, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you're attracted to characters who live in these sort of in-between spaces, and particularly when society in India is so regimented and strictly.
Yeah, I think because of that, you know, I mean, in India, of course, we have inherited a system of social hierarchy, institutionalized social hierarchy. I mean, every society in the world is unjust. Maybe there are societies that work towards justice. But here I'm talking about the caste system, the Hindu caste system, which has institutionalized a social hierarchy in such a cruel way, and it's the engine that runs modern India too. And it's not just that there are 4 castes, you know, there are 4,000 or more, and each lives in this little grid, this little mesh that is pressed down on society. Very few people, less than 5% of Indians will marry outside their caste or across religions. So it's a society to the outside the world that looks anarchic and, you know, the touchy-feely teddy bear Bollywoody democracy, but actually it's not anarchic. It's a very rigid grid that is pressed upon us. And so within that, and it's an incredible system of administration, because every person who accepts to be part of that grid then accepts the idea of oppression, the idea of accepting oppression from above and executing oppression to the one just below. So it's a way of creating a very obedient society. And there are very few who are out. I mean, I, for example, belong to a very small percentage, not that I come from an oppressed caste, but I don't have a caste, because my mother married outside and then divorced and then came back to the village, and she was, she and I and all of us were told that you just don't belong here. No one will marry you. Of course, that was a great relief for me to hear. But the thing is that, so I think when you're living outside of that grid, you naturally, your antenna are naturally coming to commune with others who are outside. So, I mean, it isn't as though I planned this, but now, I mean, when I was writing the book, it took me a long time to even know how to talk about it, because I hadn't talked about it for the 10 years that I was writing it. But now when I look at it, almost every character in the book has a kind of incendiary border running through them. The book opens with a character called Anjum, who was born Aftab in the ancient city of Shahjahanabad, and she was born. I mean, her mother thought she was a boy, but then she turned out to be a hermaphrodite, and then becomes Anjum, and ends up living. Initially, she lives in a place called the Khwabgah, which is the house of dreams, which is inside the walls of the old city, with a community of what, of course, now people call transgender, but then in Urdu they are called hijras, and they call themselves hijras, and they are a variety of genders, except women who want to be men. And then she ends up living in a graveyard. So she has the incendiary border of gender running through her. But then one of the people who starts living with her and then helps her to run this guest house that she builds in the graveyard is a man who was a Dalit, who, Dalits are the castes which were formerly called untouchable, who watches his father being beaten to death by a mob of people. I mean, it's happening every day now, but of cow protectors, because his father was transporting the carcass of a cow. And so he converts to Islam, and he calls himself Saddam Hussein, because he watches this video of Saddam's execution and is very impressed by the disdain Saddam shows for his executioners. And so he says he's going to be Saddam Hussein. So he has this incendiary border of religious conversion and caste. Tilotama, who I read about, also has a border of caste running through her. Mother's a Syrian Christian from the south, her father's Dalit. And then the story moves on to Kashmir, which is, of course, the national borders burning through everybody. And so and much of the story is set in graveyards, in a graveyard in Delhi, in graveyards in Kashmir, where the border between the living and the dead is also a bit porous. Like in Kashmir, they say that the dead are alive and the living are just dead people pretending. And in the graveyard, Anjum begins to enclose the graves of her relatives and build guest rooms over them. And there's a constant conversation with the dead. There's a porous border between human beings and animals and birds too. Even though it's in a big metropolis, there's so many creatures that make their way into the story, because the author doesn't accept that you should have human stories and animal stories, but they can all be in the same story.
So those borders are very real borders, and you've explored a lot of that in your nonfiction as well. So I'm wondering if you can speak to how your nonfiction influences your fiction, and whether that also works in the other direction as well.
Well, obviously, you know, for 20 years I have traveled through so many worlds in India. And written about them, but you know, there's a very big difference between the nonfiction and the fiction, and that is that when I've written nonfiction essays, they've always been very urgent interventions, very urgent arguments, with a very pointed idea of blowing open a space that's closing down quickly in India at that moment, at that time. So, for instance, just when, you know, huge swathes of the jungles of central India are signed over to mining companies, and suddenly the government starts talking about the greatest internal security threat being armed indigenous people, right? And they're sending paramilitary in their tens of thousands into the forest, burning villages. So I went in and wrote an essay called Walking with the Comrades, trying to explain, you know, before that the papers would not even mention mining or mention the signing over of the rivers and the mountains and the building of the highways. It was as if that had nothing to do with this war that was being pushed onto the poorest people. But the thing is that, for example, in those journeys, as well as in particular when I started to travel to Kashmir, which is of course called the unfinished business of partition between India and Pakistan, but it is the most densely militarized zone in the world. There are like 500,000 soldiers, and in the early 90s, an armed insurrection began. And it became so militarized, but now it's 2017. And what has happened is that the whole population has turned militant. So you're seeing schoolgirls throwing stones at military trucks. But when I was traveling in Kashmir, I realized that, you know, the only way you can tell this story is through fiction. Because it's not just about cataloging the dead or the disappeared or the graveyards, but what does it do to us, as Indians even, to swallow that kind of injustice and be expected to celebrate it and wave the national flag? You know, what does it do? What does it do to Americans who have to watch their government destroy country? What is it? It's not about those people, but what about us? You know, and to me, this novel is not about giving people information or making a political argument or about any kind of immediate utilitarian impulse. If the nonfiction is immediate and urgent and it's an argument, but this is creating a universe through which people can walk. You know, to me, even the idea of how do you write, I mean, I've increasingly felt that if you become very well known after writing a particular book, and generally because of the way the industry works now, fiction runs the risk of becoming domesticated. You know, you have a subject heading, you have to say, oh, my book is about X or Y or Z. And to me, the idea was separate from the fact that the story is partly set in a big city, but the idea of storytelling like a city plan, you know, like a story which has a form and a formlessness like a city does, you know, a story that can be ambushed by unauthorized structures and illegal people, a story in which you go down a blind alley and stop and smoke a cigarette with a guy and come back, and in which you know how everything works. And so it's not just about a few people set against a backdrop, but sometimes the backdrop is the foreground. And you're not shy of being extremely intimate or extremely, zoomed out, knowing and effortlessly moving between all of that. So that it's like blowing open the idea of what fiction can do, and why should we be shy of the big things.
So when you're writing then, if I'm understanding what you're saying, is the plot less important to you than the world that you're building then? Or what are you trying to do is the goal to build empathy in your reader, and what's your aim ultimately?
No aim.
No aim.
No aim. The aim is to experiment, I think, and to to try and see what fiction can do. That anything else, that something else, some other form of art simply cannot do. So to push the boundaries of this particular medium to see what it can do, and to also trust that readers are not looking for baby food. Like, I'm not in the market for baby food, like pre-digested. So there's so many things. For instance, like in India, in the north of India, every day we live in so many languages. So in the book, there's Urdu, there's Hindi, there's Sanskrit, there's Telugu, there's Malayalam. And how do you create a sense of a universe in which all these languages are spoken without being gimmicky or without, but how do you absorb the cadences of all of that? And how do you actually not walk past anyone? So say there's a one of the moments in this, there's a man whose job it is to guard a Hero Honda poster, a billboard, which is on a public toilet where people have to pay to use the toilet and no one has the money, right? So they all pee onto the hoarding. So his job is to guard the hoarding. But now, who is this man? Where does he come from? Who was he before he had this job? And what's going to happen to him when he loses it? And even though he's not a major character, I don't want to walk past him. I want to stop and talk to him,
And that character, that billboard, is it Jantar Mantar?
Yeah.
Can you describe that place? And it is or was a real place that you visited as a reporter, right?
No, not as a reporter.
No,
just as
you. Okay.
No, Jantar Mantar is a place in New Delhi. It's a sort of old observatory built by an old king in one of the old cities of Delhi. Delhi is an ancient city, like more than 1,000 years old, and so it has many ruins, built on the ruins of many cities. But that's the place where all the resistance movements, all the dreamers, the nut jobs, the hunger fast people, everybody gathers in Jantar Mantar. And in fact, even though it's not the opening of the book, it's the nerve center of the book. So you have all these people, people from the Bhopal gas tragedy, people who are displaced, people who are asking for compensation, all kinds of people, and also dreamers and artists and crazies and me, who have spent many nights there, just hanging around with people, talking to them. And that's where the baby that I read about, that's where the baby appears. And she just appears on the pavement. Obviously, her mother has abandoned her. And there are all these movements. In fact, she appears next to the group of the Kashmiri mothers for the disappeared, who don't know what to do with the baby that's appeared. And all these wise political people get into a total state about what to do with the baby, and then they decide to call the police. And actually Anjum, who's there, wants the baby, and the police come, and Tilo steals it. Chaos. But from that, all the nerves and all the stories lead out to the different places, you know. So Jantar Mantar is, in fact, I was there one night at 2 or 3 in the morning. Often what would happen is, like, if I was, let's say I'm asked to speak in a university to students. In Delhi, there's a sort of radical university called JNU. And I would often go, you know, late at night to speak in the students' mess, and there'd be like these crowds and kids standing on the tables and slogans and everyone shouting at everyone else. And so I'd say, why don't you come to Jantar Mantar? You know, you can speak to the folks, you can learn more than you learn from speaking to me. So students would come, and I would be there at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. And one such night, this baby actually did appear, and nobody knew what to do with it. And I mean, I think that was the first moment that I started thinking of the Ministry of Utmost Happiness.
Okay. So, and that's an interesting point. Womanhood and motherhood is such a strong theme in this book and your work. Can you talk a little bit about your own relationship to motherhood and your mother, and whether that influenced
It's a bad one. No, actually the book is interesting in that I think there's so many different kinds of women. For instance, Anjum, who lives in the graveyard, she finds a little girl abandoned on this. There are many children, it's true in Delhi, children disappear and appear, and, you know, hundreds, sometimes thousands of unidentified bodies are found every year, you know, on the streets. And so she finds a little girl who's abandoned on the steps of the Jama Masjid, which is the big mosque in the old city. And she basically takes her to the Khwabgah. And all of them bring up this little girl together. Her name is Zainab, and Anjum is just so much in love with the idea of motherhood, and longs to bring this baby up like a normal mother, you know. But things go wrong for her. And whereas Tilottama, on the other hand, who could be a mother, just doesn't want to be one, you know. And so there's a lot of questioning of why is this sort of stereotype of what a woman's trajectory should be pushed on women. There's so many different women with different attitudes and different ways of thinking of motherhood. I mean, Tilo's mother is a difficult and crazy mother, and Tilo just doesn't want to, you know, she thinks she'll be an even worse one, and so she's not that keen on getting involved. But there's a lot of generosity, though, among them. It's not a cold, I don't like children kind of thing. It's like, okay, let's look after this one, and you look after her. It's kind of anarchic generosity in the end between them all.
And this is a little bit of a shift, but I do want you to speak a little bit about the violence in this book and the intensity of it and the way you write about it. Can you discuss how you approach violence? And in some ways, in some cases, it's approached sort of through a haze or through a secondhand letter. So it's at arm's length, but it's also deeply impactful. I'm wondering if you could discuss how you decide to approach violence when you're writing about it.
Well, it's the greatest contradiction about India, you know, that people who look upon it as this spiritual land where everybody lives in peace, and in fact it's an extremely violent place, extremely violent. So and there is one particular form of violence, which is the violence of the mob, the violence of the majoritarian mob. So it runs through. I mean, so again, you look at it from in different ways. Like Anjum, who's born to a Shia family, she gets caught up in the 2002 daylight massacre of Muslims that took place in Gujarat in 2002. And the reason she gets caught up in it is not because she's a Hijra, but because she's a Muslim. And the reason she survives it is because she's Hijra, and people think, traditional people, sometimes those murderers thought that it's bad luck to kill her. So she survives, and she thinks of herself as butcher's luck. And, you know, she returns to the Khwabga after having gone missing for a long time, living in a refugee camp into which many Muslims, 100,000 Muslims were pushed at that point. And she returns violated in many ways, having watched the rape and the killing and the murder, and she won't talk about it. The murder of the old person she went with to Gujarat. And, you know, also having been forced to live in the men's quarters, having had her hair cut, being forced to wear men's clothes, and she comes back and she loses her you know, her happiness for a while, and eventually, quite broken, she moves into the graveyard, and she says, I'm not living here, I'm dying here, you know. When the municipality asks her to leave and says, no one can live in the graveyard, she says, I'm not living here, I'm dying here. But then she resurrects herself. But then there are other violence. Of course, there's the violence of Kashmir, which I will try and read a little bit of towards at the end. There was the massacre of Sikhs that took place on the streets of Delhi in 1984. Like 3,000 people just beaten to death, burnt, you know, had tires put over them. And so all of us are living with this constant, you know, that just below the surface, there is this violence that erupts and goes. In fact, I'd like to just read a paragraph, maybe, if I can find it quickly. One of the voices, or one of the characters in this book is a character called, his name is Biplab Dasgupta, but he's called Garson Hobart by everybody because that's a name of a character he plays in a play. And he's a bureaucrat and works in the Intelligence Bureau. And I'll just read you the part where he's meditating on this violence. As a boy in college, he watches the Sikh massacre, you know, and he says, I saw a mob lynch an old Sikh gentleman. They pulled off his turban, tore out his beard, and necklaced him South Africa style with a burning tire while people stood around, baying their encouragement. I hurried home and waited for the shock of what I had witnessed to hit me. Oddly, it never did. The only shock I felt was shock at my own equanimity. I was disgusted by the stupidity and futility of it all, but somehow I was not shocked. It could be that my familiarity with the gory history of the city I had grown up in had something to do with it. It was as though the apparition whose presence we in India are all constantly and acutely aware of had suddenly surfaced, snarling from the deep, and had behaved exactly as we expected it to. Once its appetite was sated, it sank back into its subterranean lair and normality closed over it. Maddened killers retracted their fangs and returned to their daily chores as clerks, tailors, plumbers, carpenters, shopkeepers. Life went on as before. Normality in our part of the world is a bit like a boiled egg. Its humdrum surface conceals at its heart a yolk of egregious violence. It is our constant anxiety about that violence, our memory of its past labors, and our dread of its future manifestations that lays down the rules for how a people as complex and as diverse as we are continue to coexist, continue to live together, tolerate each other, and from time to time, murder one another. As long as the center holds, as long as the yoke doesn't run, we'll be fine. In moments of crisis, it helps to take the long view. So this is the cold-hearted view of the bureaucrat, you know, the state, who can take the long view and who can look at it from a historical perspective and who isn't blown over by it, you know? So he's a very sophisticated bureaucrat who speaks in the first person here.
So I think we're going to take questions from the audience in just a moment, but I would hate to end our conversation on that note. I'm wondering if you can tell me, can you speak to the title? Because what we've just discussed does not sound anything like utmost happiness.
Well, you know, truthfully, the title is not a satirical one, and it's hard in a single conversation to discuss the strands of the book, because there's a lot of love and poetry and music and happiness in it. So sometimes I think it's an underwater city. You know, it's like you can either swim with the fish on the top or the fish in the middle or the bottom feeders, depending on how you go about it. And the Ministry of Utmost Happiness eventually is constituted, you know, and it is constituted with Anjum as the Politburo chief of what she calls the place of the falling people, you know, and people who have somehow been, it's not just, I mean, as is obvious, it's not just a book about people who live on the edges. It's even bureaucrats, and it's even the middle class and the state, all of them watching these wheels turn, and then choosing, a lot of them, to live on the periphery and to understand that happiness is something so different from what is in the prescriptions, so fragile, and just the ability to recognize it, even in its transient moments, is a great human skill, you know. And so eventually, I think you end up, or at least a lot of my friends who read the book now have all moved into the Jannat guest house in the graveyard, which is the paradise guest house in the graveyard, and we just operate from there. You know, look out at the window and just marvel at how much we love our polluted, filthy, violent city, you know, or country or whatever it is, but just of how these fragile people are so full of humor and the ability to recognize and live inside the moment for a while, you know, with no sense of wanting to build institutions over it.
Well, thank you. I think we're going to take some questions from the audience now. There should be folks with microphones.
Thank you so much for coming. You're such an incredible source of inspiration, particularly to those of us who are new to the craft of writing. My question to you is, who serves similarly in that role for you? Who do you read to inspire your work and to inform your work?
Well, I was just talking to someone the other day about the fact that I have read the audio of this book, and while I read it, I realized that I already have an audio track. Like when I write with the sound of the words, not just the words on the page. And I am ashamed to admit that one of my great inspirations is a racist and imperialist writer called Rudyard Kipling. But I have the sound of, you know, when Cheel the kite brings home the night that Mang the bat sets free. The herd is locked in byre and hut, for free till dawn are we. This is the hour of pride and power, of talon and tush and claw. Oh, hear the call, good hunting all that keeps the jungle law. To me. And I mean, my influences also at a very young age, a person you may not have heard about called Shakespeare, but also truly as a form of storytelling in a real way, I grew up in a village in Kerala, and there is a dance form there called Kathakali, which means storytelling, right? And always it's only performed by men, and they first get very stoned, and they take about 5 hours to be made up, and by the time they're made up, they are who they play. And it is a dance form in which the body of the dancer turns into everything. So at the back of this book it says, how to tell a shattered story by slowly becoming everybody. No, by slowly becoming everything. And I've seen those dancers becoming everything. They can function on the epic. They can become a woman looking at herself in the mirror. They can become the fish in the river. They can become the river. They can become the monkey with his tail lazily on the road, blocking the path. So that kind of fitness and flexibility is so beautiful, and it frees you. So yeah.
Something you just said about realizing that happiness is a transient thing, very different from prescriptions of happiness. Do you find when you travel away from that macrocosm that you know so well and come to worlds here where happiness has a very clear prescription, do you compartmentalize your view of the world? Do you inure yourself from what happiness means here? How do you reconcile the two different, or more than two different ideas of what life is and experiences of what life is?
The two different?
Experiences of what life is and therefore what happiness is. Do you feel that?
Well, I mean, honestly, I've never lived anywhere except in India. Like, I've never studied outside, so I don't have much experience of spending any amount of time anywhere else. But so the only thing I do, I do find difficult when I come out of India is that I really miss the fact that the chaos. Like I find it frightening when there's no chaos. I kind of need it. So it's like wherever I go, there are animals and there are birds and there are mad people, and nothing is insulated, and so. Here, I suppose it would take me a bit of time to adjust. Like, I have found myself thinking that if I had a choice between being in prison in India and living outside, which would I choose? I mean, I don't think I would want to be in prison, but it's difficult for me to know to answer your question because I haven't lived outside. I should, I guess, but it's a bit late.
I guess my question has to do with sort of if you're writing from a post-colonial perspective, if you're writing from these countries that are that have these very fraught histories, right? And in your fiction, you're trying to witness them, right? But at the same time, it's a struggle to not have your characters become stereotypes for the larger struggles that they're going through. So it's like, how do you humanize your characters, but at the same time, not having them become poster boys for larger structural issues? Thank you.
Well, first of all, let's wonder whether we are actually post-colonial. I mean, I don't know about that. Not just that imperialism on a global scale continues, but also that within India, since 1947, there's not been one single day in which the Indian Army has not been deployed within its own borders against, quote unquote, its own people. And tens of thousands have been killed. So many people who live within the borders of of the country that has been defined as India do feel colonized still. So that, having said that, look, if you're not starting, I mean, the worst trap that I could have fallen into if I were writing fiction would have been to have some ideological agenda and then place these puppet characters and then animate them to play out my story that I wanted to tell. But that's just something that my DNA would revolt against. I just could not do that, you know. So that's why I said, when you're thinking about the planning of a city, I actually have studied architecture and urban design, and I do think about how when you plan a city, you can't plan it. It ambushes you all the time, and you deal with those. And so, for example, the character of Garson Hobart, he ambushed me, you know, and I could so easily have made him some straw man, some easy meat, some bad guy, but no, he's an extremely sophisticated thinker and someone who challenged me every day as a writer, you know, and I enjoyed it. So, I mean, on no account would any writer worth anything be creating stereotypes or even thinking that that colonialism has gone anywhere. It's just gone to the workshop and come out undented, you know.
The way you have been talking and the way you write your essays, especially non-fiction essays, you speak out against your government and you speak out against the issues that really matter in India now, against Kashmir and against all the other things that your government does. I don't think your government takes it too well. So how does your country view you as a fiction writer? Do they embrace you and do they think, well, this is one of the greatest writers that ever came around, like the rest of the world does? We're all fawning at you, you know. But does your country believe you to be that writer, like the way we do?
There's no such thing as a country. Honestly, there's no such thing. You know, country is a construct. The country does not have a single mind or a single heart or a single brain. America, who is going to say what America thinks? Who would have that temerity, you know, to homogenize all these views, all this politics, all these people? Similarly, in India, there's no such thing as India, there's no such thing as they. You know, of course, there is a huge majoritarian tendency going on now, and there is, because of the way in which the ownership of the media is structured, the media is being forced to toe the line. Cowardice is not an uncommon thing among intelligentsia historically, you know. So, yes, sure, there's lots of hostility, but there's also a huge embrace, you know. There's, like, people ask me in India, how do you get feedback for your work? I say, I go and stand at the traffic lights, you know. So it's true. I go and stand at the traffic lights. I mean, I'm speaking to you now. I can next month be speaking to 5,000 Sikh farmers in the Punjab, you know. And India's got such a great deal of wisdom amongst the people who have stood up, who have seen off. I mean, the poorest people in India have seen off the richest corporations, you know. So there's by no means just one view of anything. And although you're absolutely right that there is a very frightening tunnel that we are passing through now, and many of us have our backs to the wall, including me. But I don't feel at all, I mean, they would like me to say that, oh, I'm this brave, lone voice of the voiceless, all alone, standing up. That's not true. I speak from the heart of a crowd. There's so many brave people doing so much brilliant stuff, you know. So I do not feel alone. I do not feel frightened. I wear the slurs that come my way as a badge of honor. And as Thilo's mother quotes Shakespeare to her, then will I strip my sleeves and show my scars and say these wounds had I on Christmas Day. So it's fine.
So before we wrap up, we're going to be treated to one more reading, and then there will be a book signing following the event.
I can't make up my mind what to read. But should I read there or I read here? Why not? Okay, I'll read from Kashmir. So this is a chapter called The Untimely Death of Miss Jabin I. And it begins with a quote of James Baldwin, which says, "And they would not believe me precisely because they would know that what I said was true." Ever since she was old enough to insist, she had insisted on being called Miss Jabin. It was the only name she would answer to. Everyone had to call her that. Her parents, her grandparents, the neighbors too. She was a precocious devotee of the Miss fetish that gripped the Kashmir Valley in the early years of the insurrection. All of a sudden, fashionable young ladies, especially in the towns, insisted on being addressed as Miss. Miss Momin, Miss Ghazala, Miss Farhana. It was only one of the many fetishes of the times. In those blood-dimmed years, for reasons nobody fully understood, people became what can only be described as fetish-prone. Other than the Miss fetish, there was a nurse fetish, a PT instructor fetish, and a roller skating fetish. So in addition to checkposts, bunkers, weapons, grenades, landmines, Cassipirs, concertina wire, soldiers, insurgents, counterinsurgents, spies, special operatives, double agents, triple agents, and suitcases of cash from the agencies on both sides of the border, the valley was also awash with nurses, PT instructors, and roller skaters, and of course, misses. Among them, Miss Jabin, who didn't live long enough to become a nurse nor even a roller skater. In the Mazar-e-Shohada, the martyr's graveyard where she was first buried, the cast iron signboard that arched over the main gate said in 2 languages, "We gave our todays for your tomorrows." It's corroded now, the green paint faded, the delicate calligraphy flecked with pinholes of light. Still, there it is, after all these years, silhouetted like a swatch of stiff lace against the sapphire sky and the snowy, saw-toothed mountains. There it still is. Miss Jabin was not a member of the committee that decided what should be written on the signboard, but she was in no position to argue with its decision. Also, Miss Jabin hadn't notched up very many todays to trade in for tomorrows, but then the algebra of infinite justice was never so rude. In this way, without being consulted on the matter, she became one of the movement's youngest martyrs. She was buried right next to her mother, Begum Arifa Yeswi. Mother and daughter died by the same bullet. It entered Miss Jabin's head through her left temple and came to rest in her mother's heart. In the last photograph of her, the bullet wound looked like a cheerful summer rose arranged just above her left ear. A few petals had fallen onto her kafan, the white shroud she was wrapped in before she was laid to rest. Miss Jabin and her mother were buried along with 15 others, taking the toll of their massacre to 17. At the time of their funeral, the Mazar-e-Shohada was still fairly new, but was already getting crowded. However, the Intizamiya Committee, the organizing committee, had its ear to the ground from the very beginning of the insurrection and had a realistic idea of things to come. It planned the layout of the graves carefully, making ordered, efficient use of the available space. everyone understood how important it was to bury martyrs' bodies in collective burial grounds and not leave them scattered in their thousands like bird feed up in the mountains or in the forests around the army camps and torture centers that had mushroomed across the valley. When the fighting began and the occupation tightened its grip, for ordinary people, the consolidation of their dead became in itself an act of defiance. Thank you.